He's going to share with us Ezekiel 35, Mountains of Israel. So welcome, John Heller.
So, hang on a second. For some reason, okay. There's a way to minimize that Chrome bar at the top on the, okay. So I picked up a name tag, it says Doug. So I guess they really wanted this to, makes me feel kind of unwelcome, but I thought I would cover up the Under Armour. I had somebody comment on a YouTube channel that I must be part of the Illuminati because this is a devil's horn Masonic symbol or something like that. And I'm like, okay, I guess that's the way it is. So the Mountains of Israel. I teach each week at Church Fellowship Bible Chapel. We meet in Lewis Center, Ohio, which is between Columbus and Delaware. We started the church about 4 years ago. We put all of our teachings up there. I don't have any DVDs or anything like that for sale. Everything I've done is up on YouTube. In Vimeo, we live stream. We also do Facebook Live most Sundays. So if you want to see that and follow, I do a prophecy update, looking at news and current events and what's going on every week. Usually I'm able to keep that to an hour and 20 minutes, just because my wife is not here, my dear wife of 42 years, Pam, and I always say when she is in the audience that if you see somebody doing this, it's not some crazy charismatic that wandered into the church. It's just my wife, this means bring it in for a landing. You've made your point, and this means the nursery workers are dying, you need to cut it off. So she's not here, so she's probably watching. I'm probably going to get a text now if she's watching. So I grew up, my father was a Grace Brethren pastor, and he loved Bible prophecy. Back in June, when Israel, we were there when they had Yom Yerushalayim Day, the 50th anniversary celebration in May 24th. And we were there during the Trump visit, and somebody had graciously allowed us to use their apartment in Jerusalem about 1 block from the new gate of the old city. So it was a very convenient location. And I came home, and when Dad died about 25, 26 years ago, he was very meticulous the way he kept things. Like, he had every encouraging letter he had ever received from anybody in his life was in a file. The congratulations from fairly well-known people back in their day, theologians and college presidents congratulating him on his ordination and that sort of thing. But he also kept all of his sermon notes were on those little half notebook-sized pages in notebooks, arranged by subject, title, and then they were all typed out, and they had the date that he gave them. And he would say, I reworked this, and I did it on radio in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where he pastored, or in Ohio. And the interesting thing about Dad was everyone had a label. You know those label makers? And it's kind of a funny family story. Dad was a label-making fool. And it was sort of a family joke, so when my wife and I went, we were engaged, went to him he was marrying us, so we went to him for premarital counseling. And essentially, don't mess up and be nice to her. But we get in his office, and he's not there yet. And I said, look at that. And there was a stapler, and she picked it up, and it had a label on it that said stapler. And then I said, well, come here and look. And there was a label on the desk that said desk, and there was one on the chair, and there was one on the label maker that said label maker. So I think it was sort of like, those little spinner things that people have now to distract them. I think that was like the spinner thing that Dad used back in the days to not distract him. So Dad loved Israel, Dad loved Bible prophecy. And when I was looking through his notes, I just thought, I'll look at his notes and see if he has anything on prophecy. So I went down on June 20th, and June 21st is Father's Day, and I looked and I found his sermon notes from June, and I used them the next day, showed them on slides. From June 21st, 1967, he was all fired up. So 50 years, I just happened to look at for it the night before and found it literally in the last of the boxes that I looked at. And so there it was 50 years ago on Father's Day. I was able to use his sermon notes and read from them. And the reason why he was writing about it in 67 was because the Six-Day War, and he talked about it for weeks, what had happened and the significance of it and Bible prophecy and everything. So I say that not to waste time, but to show that that's the legacy that I grew up with. And it was always talked about in my home. We would have prophecy conferences with guys like John Whitcomb and other people, and they would come over to the house and you would sit around the table. Kids didn't go run off and play games or anything. You sat at the table and talked with the adults. And so here they're having these discussions about Bible prophecy, and Whitcomb wrote the Genesis, co-authored the Genesis flood, talking about creation and the flood and all this stuff. And that's what I grew up with. And really, I wish more homes were like that today, because kids pick this stuff up. So in our church, we pretty much insist that everybody above 5 be in the church service. It's not going to kill the kid, and that's just our thing. And they'll pick it up as they pay attention. So that's just our philosophy. So look, I've been to Israel 3 times. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ezekiel 35, and I'm going to talk some about the trip that we just took 2 months ago. It's interesting timing. In 2011, March of 2011, we were in Israel. We were staying at a resort on the south end of the Sea of Galilee. And the morning we were leaving to go back down to Qumran and then on to Jerusalem, I got the newspaper at this resort, and they were talking about riots on the street in a town called Dara, 30 miles away. So here we are in a resort in peaceful, prosperous Israel, and 30 miles away, the beginning of the Syrian civil war is starting. I mean, there are county seats that are further away from us in Columbus, and it shows how close all these things are. And so now 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 Syrians are dead, and Syria is in complete meltdown. And it started just over there when we were there. And we know that, Zechariah 12 says Jerusalem will be a cup of trembling. Now, I don't have the sound on this, but this is an interview with Richard Engel on April 13th, 2011, sort of in the midst of the beginning of what they called the Arab Spring. And in this interview, he says, Brian Williams asked him, what do you think is going to happen? And he says, I think we're going to, this could ultimately involve Israel. That's what I'm hearing on the Arab street. And then Brian Williams goes, well, how does it end? And then Richard Engel goes, over time, I think this ends in Jerusalem. Now, I don't think he's a student of Bible prophecy or not. And so that's one of the things I do when I do my prophecy updates is, when secular people are talking about things, people unlearned in Bible prophecy and unfamiliar with the scriptures, talk about the things that happen in Bible prophecy using almost exactly the same language that's used. I think it's time for people to wake up and pay attention, get their lives in order, and do the right things. Because when this begins to unfold, and one of the things I've talked about for many years is a convergence of events. And as we get closer and closer to the ultimate, the second coming of Christ and the setting up of his millennial kingdom, it's like a vortex. It's like we're being sucked down into a vortex, and things are going to get very turbulent, and they're going to happen very quickly. In one of my talks, I have a video that I like to use. It's of the tsunami that hit Thailand back in 2003 or Boxing Day 2004, the day after Christmas. And the interesting thing was that before the tsunami hit the beaches there in Thailand at those resorts, the water all drained out of the bay. And people were out walking around. Oh, look at the coral. We usually have to snorkel this. Isn't that neat? Oh, look at this. Look at, and they're walking around. And then you can see in the video, there's like a white cap all the way across the horizon in the ocean. And then all of a sudden, some people start to look and they're like, what is that? That's weird. Somebody goes, it's a tsunami. Nah, it's not a tsunami. And then they see it flip a big boat over, and then it's like tsunami, and the people that understand what's coming head for the hills. I think it's a great picture of the tsunami of events and Bible prophecy that's going to come and hit us. And this is one that I think fits in. I mean, this is this conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran right now that's going on, and how it plays out. So this is some of the things I do. This is from back in November of 2014. I just pulled this out of an old slide update that I did. Now, I have to confess to you, I read the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz. I have a program that gives me about 6,000 newspapers, as a digital version of about 6,000 newspapers around the world. I read a bunch of magazines, intelligence reports, and that type of thing. And I pay attention. And I have to tell you, I went back and looked at this slide, and you know what? Shame on me, I forgot that this slaughter happened in Jerusalem back in November of 2014, the 4 rabbis being killed. I'd completely forgotten about it. And so I guess, so what I'm saying is that this has been going on for a while, what we see, but I do think we see an acceleration of all these things happening. And back then they were talking about the battle over Jerusalem. And here we are almost 3 years later. This was right after the conference we did in Dublin in 2013. So let me move forward here to, there we go. So we're going to talk about the mountains of Israel. And we were just there, and most tours, when you go to Israel, you will go up the coast, across the north part of the country, and down through the Jordan Valley, and then down to Qumran, and then back up to Jerusalem. But what you miss is this area that very few tours go to, and we were blessed this time. We had a private guide provided to us, archaeologist named Joel Kramer. You can check out his website at sourceflix.com. And he asked me what I wanted to do. Well, I've been there a couple times, so I mentioned some of the places we've been. I'd like to go to Tel Dan, spend a little more time. And he goes, well, everybody goes there. How about we go some other places? So what we did was we got in the car and we went to a bunch of different places. We went to Hebron, Shiloh, Shechem, Bethel, Jericho. And I must tell you, the reason why I'm talking about this tonight is that trip, every trip to Israel, if you let it, will have a tremendous impact on your faith. It's very faith reaffirming. But this one really affected me, particularly the trip to Hebron. And because what you get when you go through the West Bank, I prefer to use the term Judea and Samaria, but I might slip and use the West Bank because that's what everybody calls it, is the scope of the conflict between Israel and the people that are called Palestinian Arabs. Now, we can argue about their origin and whatnot, but if we take Ezekiel seriously, that Ezekiel wrote for our time, and Ezekiel's 34 through 39 and on to the end of the book are talking about events in the future, I want to read through with you Ezekiel 35 tonight, share with you some of the things, because I personally believe, and I know others will disagree, that Ezekiel 35 is describing exactly what we see in Israel today. Now, we can argue what it means, and we can talk about Psalm 83 and all these other things, but I personally believe this is a flashpoint, and it will be dealt with at some point. Now, there are prophecies that I think apply in Obadiah, and those seem to be tied to the day of the Lord. We can even argue about when that starts and happens, but I am telling you, this problem is irresolvable, and the only way it's going to be resolved is Jesus come back and set up his kingdom and take care of it. But in the near term and the near short term, long term, whatever you want to call it, this problem is going to exist. So let's read a little bit, understand where I believe the origins of this problem are, and what the scripture says about it. Moreover, verse 1, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it, and say to it, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, Mount Seir, and I will stretch out my hand against you, and make you a desolation and a waste. I will lay waste your cities, and you will become a desolation. Then you will know that I am the Lord. And this gets into how you interpret or look at these prophetic passages, because I'm not sure that Ezekiel 34 through 39 is exactly sequential. The chapter verses were not there. And Ezekiel says, I had this vision, then I had this vision, then I had this vision. I think they are largely chronological, but every now and then, and Doug, you know, we've talked about this, he kind of leaps all the way to the end, and then they'll know that I am the Lord. But there may be, I hate to use the term, a gap in between this passage, and this gap is okay. Okay, it has the Doug stamp of approval on the gap. This gap. So Mount Seir is identified. In Genesis 25, we get a clue as to what is going to happen in the future. If you want to understand Bible prophecy of the end, learn the history of what happened at the beginning, because there is a pattern. And so in Genesis 25, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him, and Rebekah and his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it is so, why then am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, paraphrase, You got a war going on inside you, girl. The two nations are in your womb, and two peoples will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment. They named him Esau. Afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. When you go over to chapter 36, you get some more information about Esau. Now, these are the records of the generations of Esau. That is Edom. Esau took his wives from the daughters of Canaan, also Basemath, Ishmael's daughter. So, if the conflict that was going on inside continued outside, we see through those chapters of Genesis, and then Esau not only continues the conflict, but he marries people that are in conflict with the descendants of Jacob already. And it is my belief, strong belief, that this conflict that started in the womb of Rebekah is playing out in front of us today. And I think it's both physical and obviously spiritual. And it's almost, the hatred it's inexplicable. And I'll share just a little bit about that. It's interesting, Doug Woodward mentioned DNA. Last week they just came out, and what they did was they had 5 bodies that they found buried that were in Canaanite ruins, And they did DNA, and then they compared it to, they did about 100 DNA tests on people in Lebanon, and they found out that there's a very close match between the Canaanites and the people that live in Lebanon. And it's interesting, you know, Israel didn't do what they were supposed to do to wipe out those people. They went north and eventually. And it's interesting now that we have this conflict among the people that live there in Lebanon, Hezbollah and whatnot, and Israel. And so is the genetic thing playing out in front of us? And will they be able to identify Jewish people when they dig up bones in the hill country of Ephraim or down in Judah and compare that to the DNA of Jewish people today? There's a lot of information that these things had never happened before. This is a game changer. And I will just say, wait and see what happens, but understand. And so the press was like, oh, the Canaanites they like destroyed in the Bible. No, they weren't destroyed. That's the point. You don't even know your Bible, but we'll trust your science for now a little bit. But it's a very interesting finding that this is going on. So Esau lived in the hill country of Seir. Esau is Edom, and this is the southern third of Jordan, south of the Dead Sea. It's where Petra is. And we know that historically, this was a problem. And Edom, who is identified in Ezekiel 35, has this. It says, because you have had everlasting enmity and have delivered the sons of Israel to the power of the sword at the time of their calamity. It's probably talking about the Babylonian captivity that had just taken place. Ezekiel, of course, is prophesying from Babylon. At the time of the punishment of the end. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord God, I will give you over to bloodshed, and bloodshed will pursue you. Since you have not hated bloodshed, therefore bloodshed will pursue you. I will make Mount Seir a waste and a desolation. I will cut it off from one who passes through and returns. I will fill its mountains with its slain. On your hills and in your valleys and in all your ravines, those slain by the sword will fall. I will make you an everlasting desolation, and your cities will not be inhabited. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Now there is, and why? I guess is the question is, why is this? Why is there this enmity? Well, back to Genesis 35, because you have said, these two nations and these two lands will be mine and we will possess, I think this is Ezekiel 35, I'm sorry. These two nations and these two lands will be mine and we will possess them. Although the Lord was there, therefore as I live, declares the Lord God, I will deal with you according to your anger and according to your envy, which you showed because of your hatred against them. So I will make myself known among them when I judge you. And the judgment is coming. And we know that historically, the conflict between the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob continued everywhere they went. We know the story of Esther and Haman. Haman was an Amalekite. He was of this stock in this area. And I believe a descendant of Esau. And so all the way over in Persia, the conflict continued. When we were in Israel, we went to this place, the Herodian, Herod's palace outside of Bethlehem. It's a steep walk. It was over 100 degrees, and it's a fascinating sight. I believe this is looking at this, below the blue tarp there is what I believe is Herod's tomb. I believe I'm on the right side there. Sad story, the person who found that after looking for it for decades was taking a tour group up there, pointing out things, and took a step backward and actually fell down in the tomb about 100 feet and passed away about 3 years after he verified that it was Herod's tomb. But Herod was an Edomite, and he did things, and we'll look at some of the things he did. And we know about the wheat and tares. I really don't have time to get into that. But in Esther, Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai, a Jew, in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. And Haman got his. Haman went out that day glad, and so they hang Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. And so the same judgment that's visited upon Haman, the judgment that was visited by Samuel on Agag, you know, the passage where it says Samuel hacked Agag to pieces. I'm glad with prophecy conferences, we may argue, but we're not hacking anybody apart. You know, we may want to, but we're not doing that. Back to Ezekiel 35. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have heard all your revilings, which you have spoken against the mountains of Israel, saying, they are laid desolate, they are given to us for food, and you have spoken arrogantly against me and have multiplied your words against me. I have heard it. And this continues on, according to Ezekiel, all the way to the end. So when we were there, we went to a number of cities. We've been to Dan before. And what is interesting when you track what Abraham, later Abraham, when he came to Israel, was he went to places that are located and he sojourned and lived in the mountains of Israel. So he started out at Dan. When you go to Dan, the Shechem, Shiloh, Hebron, and Bethel. And this is sort of the modern day cities that are near these places. When you go into these, a lot of these places now are in what they call Area A. And, you know, when our guide was taking us, he's an American who had grown up in Saudi Arabia. His dad was in the oil business. So he spoke Arab. So he could read each one of these things on the sign, but I'm like, you know, should we really be going in here? Because it says it's not really safe. And if you're an Israeli citizen, you're not allowed to go in there. And so we had this division of the land between Area A, which is sort of the light-colored area, the Jewish control areas in the blue, and then there's sort of the special, how we're going to deal with the situation in Jerusalem. And as you travel through there, you see these signs, you see fences and all this. When we were in Shechem, our guide, we went up to the top of Mount Gerizim, and he said, see that big house over there? That's probably the richest guy in the West Bank. And I said, what does he do? And Joel said, I don't know. I said, my guess is he sells security fencing to the Israelis. Because their security fences, I mean, the whole road in from Jerusalem, coming in Highway 1, is just, you know, there's fence and separate roads and underpasses, and it's all very complicated. It's much more complicated than when you start looking at the road maps. I don't know how our guide got around. I asked him a couple times, well, how would I get here if I wanted to come back? And he goes, I don't know. You know, I don't know what the roads are. I just know that I drive and I get the right place. When I was in Jerusalem, I thought, well, what if I wanted to go to Hebron? So I got Google Maps out and I put in Hebron, and you know what it said? That route is not possible. Now, I'd just been there a few days before, so I know it's possible, so I think somehow they don't want you to go there. And the timeline of Abraham's life, though, one of the cities that we went to was Hebron. And Hebron, well, a number of the cities are very important. He first came, it wasn't called Dan at the time, but at Dan, as you go to the tell there, you walk around, and as you're coming out, there's a gate there. It's one of the most ancient gates ever found archaeologically in the world. And you can say with some certainty that when Abraham, or Abram at the time, came to this area, he walked through that gate. And they've uncovered it. It has a very interesting arch design to it. There's also the temple there. This was the northern border area. When you stand there, there are trenches near this, the holy site there, at the north part of the tell. And the Syrian border is there, and the foxholes are right there from the '67 war. And up the hill, about 1.5 miles away, is a Lebanese village, is Lebanon. And so it's right where all these different countries converge today. And you can see that it's what all this stuff happened at Dan, and this is where Jeroboam erected one of his 2 golden calves. And you can go there today, and I sort of superimposed an altar there. Jeroboam erected an altar, and you can say with virtual certainty that this is the place in 2 Kings, I think it's 11:12, chapter 11 or 12, where Jeroboam erected the altar and then put the golden calf up on the high place. Guaranteed. And you could walk the site and you can get a feel for what the people who came there to worship. And I've done a teaching about that, about the 2, for lack of a better, well, Ezekiel calls them whores, Aholah and Aholibah, and you can look that up on the internet under my name on YouTube, and you should be able to find it. And so he put one at Bethel at the southern border, he put one at the northern border to mark out the land. In Genesis 23, we see one of the mentions of Hebron. And I apologize, I usually have like a preview of my slides, but it's not working right now. But in Hebron, there's a site called the Cave of Machpelah. And the interesting thing about Hebron, and I did a little teaching on it a few weeks ago called Why Hebron Matters. Interestingly enough, we've had well over 120 Palestinians in the West Bank looking at our church Facebook page and website. And some of them they don't have pictures of flowers that they're holding. They're Hamas and that type of thing. In Gaza City, and professors from some of the universities in the West Bank have been, I don't know if we were a class project or what, but Sarah was 127 years old, and the story is she died. And Abraham wanted to bury her, and so he went to this Hittite guy to buy a cave in Hebron. And so today you can actually go to that cave. Now, the first thing that happened was that the guy wanted to give the cave to Abraham. And he said, no, I want to buy it. I want to buy it. Hear us, my Lord. Thou art a mighty prince among us, Abraham. And in the choice of our sepulchres, bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth. And he continued on, and you can read about the story there, and he bought the cave, and he paid a good price for it. And it was the first place that the father of Jacob, the grandfather of Jacob, bought property in Israel. And what you see as you go through Genesis chapter 23 and the rest of Genesis is that over and over and over again, every time this cave comes up, it mentions that Abraham bought this for a burying place. And it appears that the Lord, working through Moses when he wrote Genesis, wanted us to know that Abraham owned this place and bought it and was buried there. And today, it's disputed, hotly disputed. It also talks about in Genesis 23, the field of Ephraim, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, and I'll talk about that. But there's no question that Abraham bought this cave. He buried Sarah in it. He was buried in it. Isaac and Rebekah were buried in it. Jacob and Leah were buried in it. And since that time, the Israel Jews people have honored this as the burial place of the patriarchs and their wives. Genesis 25. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephraim, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. Then Jacob, it talks about in Genesis 35, that Jacob came to this area when he was alive, and we know the story of him. And when Isaac died, Isaac was buried in the cave of Mamre. So then in Genesis 49, Jacob dies. And as he's there in Egypt, he says, "Take me and bury me in the cave of Machpelah," which Abraham bought for a burying place. And they honored that. They carried him all the way back from Egypt and buried him there. So, and he told him, "This is where I buried Leah. This is where we buried Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah." Genesis 50 talks about him being buried. So I'll talk about Hebron in just a moment and the Cave of Machpelah. But there's another holy site in Hebron called Mamre. And this is also referred to. Now, understand the geography is Hebron is in the tribal area of Judah. It's the capital of Judah. It's where David ruled for 7 years. And it's in a mountainous area. And when you go up to the Herodian, I wish I had my photograph of it. Hebron was one of the water sources for the temple of Solomon and later Herod, the first and second temples. And you can see remnants of the aqueduct that carried water from Hebron. And when you stand at the Herodian, you get a picture. Hebron is way up here. Bethlehem is here. And the Temple Mount is essentially here. And the geography of Jerusalem is very interesting because when we walked from our apartment that we were staying at down to the Damascus Gate, it was down. And as you're walking downhill, you walk downhill and you get to where you view over the wall there at the Damascus Gate, and you can just barely see the Dome of the Rock. And then you get in and you walk down even further. So the Temple Mount's not the highest point in Jerusalem, obviously, but it's a very important point. But you get the picture. You can see water goes downhill, and you can see the downhill flow of the water all the way to the temple from up there. But there's also this place at Mamre, and it talks about in Genesis 13 and 18 that Yahweh met Abraham by the great oaks of Mamre. And this is where Sarah was in the tent. They had the prophecy that they would have a child and all the blessings that flowed with that. And Sarah laughed. And it was funny when we were there at Mamre, the kids were up playing and they were laughing, and you could almost hear Sarah laughing. But in the bedrock at Mamre, there are circular places, and our Joel says, "What do you think that is?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, sister." And he goes, "No, that's where large trees grew up through the bedrock, and there are a number of them around." And they're pretty sure this is guaranteed the site of where Abram pitched his tent in Mamre. And it's been treated as a holy site for millennia. That's usually how you can figure out that something significant happened, because they only build like temples and holy sites and churches on top of it. And it's interesting, the city of Hebron has grown up around this, but they've not built on this site. Other places they built, but for some reason not on this particular site. Now, Herod built at 3 places to commemorate pilgrimage sites. One was Mamre, one was the Cave of Machpelah, and the other was the Temple Mount. And you can see the Herodian stones there at Mamre. They have a particular characteristic. They look like the ones at the Temple Mount. They look like the ones just a couple miles away at the Cave of Machpelah. Constantine, when he came, he built to commemorate certain holy sites in Israel, in this area of what we would call the mountains of Israel. And he built at Mamre, just like Herod did. He built at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Bethlehem, and the Mount of Olives to commemorate those sites. Hebron has long been a flashpoint. It is, the Cave of Machpelah is the second holiest site in Judaism. In 1929, there was a massacre of women and children at a synagogue, and about 67 or 69 were killed. Some people say that what happened in 1929 across the Holy Land, but particularly focused in Hebron, was year zero of the Israeli-Arab conflict. What happened in Hebron was they said that the Jews were going to change something at the Temple Mount. The Mufti said that, got the Arab Muslims fired up, and they came down and they slaughtered a bunch of men, women, and children. And there was also a terrible incident where a Jewish person went in and shot and killed about 25 people. I think that was in 1994 in the mosque above the Cave of Machpelah at Hebron. This is a picture in 1929. These are Jews fleeing Jerusalem because of the onslaught of what was going on with the Arab conflict. They're walking out from the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem. Today, Hebron, if you think the area of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, is complicated, Hebron is even worse. This is one of the maps that I found that shows sort of how Hebron is divided. And so they've divided it into a bunch of different areas. I'm telling you that it just hit me in the face. Look, I've read about this all the time. I've been to Israel a couple times, but I've never been in that particular area where you can see and feel the conflict that goes on. And Hebron remains the epicenter of this. In fact, the radical Arabs in Hebron were exported by the Mufti to other areas of the West Bank, like Ramallah and Nablus, to set up more conflict in the future. Because, the Mufti we worry about, election cycles and what happened 24 hours ago. They're thinking centuries ahead and setting things up for conflict that's going to last forever. And so you have the Tell at Hebron, which is over here to the left, and then you have the Cave of Machpelah, which is over here, and then the old city of Hebron in between. The old city of Hebron, to get in there, you have to go through security checkpoints. There's Israeli soldiers all over the place. There are turnstiles like you have at the amusement park, so you can't come back in. This is an example of one of them at Hebron. As we were there, we went to the Cave of Machpelah and we went up to the Tell. You see the sign there, "Welcome to Apartheid Street." And it's no man's land. They've closed all the shops. Nobody lives there. The shops are all closed, block after block. And yet, what happens, and so there's no question that the Jews have this tie to Hebron forever, since the time of Abraham. And so here's UNESCO a couple of weeks ago voting to say it's a Palestinian site. And I saw the Palestinian ambassador to the UN speaking at the UN last week's Security Council, and he had a State of Palestine sign in front of him, and I didn't know there was one. And so we live in this world of legal fictions that people have created. Well, this is the Cave of Machpelah. There's no doubt that Herod built this. If you see where the stones go up and there's a little angle in, that's a parapet, and that was classic Herodian construction. This building stands in virtually the same condition as it did, constructed over 2,000 years ago. And to give you some scope, when Herod built that building 2,000 years ago, which, by the way, has been through multiple earthquakes. This is not an area that's not unknown to have massive earthquakes. And it still stands as it was constructed. When Herod built it 2,000 years ago, that was almost 2,000 years after Abraham bought the cave. The Jews were, and that structure, what's in the green there, that's been added in later construction, the minarets for the mosque and what's that. For many years, for 700 years, Christian Jews were only allowed to go to that part, this what they call the seventh step, and pray. When we were there were maybe 30 people there, including the worshipers in the mosque and the synagogue side. That's where the seventh step is. And so this cave, this building, this Cave of Machpelah, is sort of the epicenter of the conflict between the Jews and Arabs. So next I'm going to talk about another city that relates to the conquest that existed at the time of Abraham, because there's clues all throughout Genesis as to where these sites are. So Genesis says Bethel is west of Ai, and Ai is east of Bethel. So if you find Bethel, you can find Ai. You just go to where you find a city. So we went to Ai, and this happened everywhere we went pretty much on this trip. It was Pam and I and Joel. Nobody else was there. And I know it's difficult to get there on tours. You got to have a bulletproof glass on your bus. You have to have armor plate. You have to have a Palestinian guide. And it's a tragedy because the rich heritage of the occupation of the Jewish people of Israel in the land is in the mountains of Israel. And now it's the place where they're largely excluded from. And it's the area that everybody wants to give away to the Palestinians. And the conflict continues. But so when Joshua comes in for the conquest, late Bronze Age, he comes to Ai. And there's a battle there, and you can go to Ai, you can walk up on the tell, and you can see how he came up from the Jordan Valley, camped here. He sent his people around behind the hill to make an ambush, and he went in, and they burned the city, and they killed the king of Ai. And they said, Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation unto this day. And it is. You walk up there, don't wear sandals, because there's jiggers and thistles all over the place. But nobody goes there. I don't know, 25, 50 people a week maybe. We never saw anybody. And we never see anybody leaving or coming. He hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua gave command, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the city gate and raised it over a great heap of stones that stands to this day. That's what was written in the book of Joshua, thousands of years ago. Now, I am all out of sequence. Excuse me here. I'm not sure why that happened. So let me go to my slides. Okay, here we go. Sorry about this, I'm gonna have to go do this a couple times. So here's Ai, near Bethel. This wall was built late Bronze Age. If you go to Bethel, it's covered over now, but they have pictures and drawings, and it'll say, this wall built like this is late Bronze Age. That is the time of the conquest of Joshua. Biblical archaeology is misnamed because most of it is to disprove the Bible. Now, the guy we had, Joel Kramer, is a biblical archaeologist who actually believes the Bible is true. And so he's gone to Bethel. He knows all the people who live around these neighborhoods that come out and offer him coffee, invite us in. And at Bethel, they have a wall. It looks exactly like this, and every archaeologist in the world agrees it's late Bronze Age. You go 2 miles away to Ai, and they say, I don't think that's a late bronze wall. But when they came there and excavated it, they dig down through layers, they discovered something at Ai. Remember it says a great heap of stones? They found over the temple area, where the Bible says it would be, a heap of stones 25 feet high over the whole temple. And yet they will deny anything that the Bible says. They'll deny any connection of the people of Israel to the mountains of Israel. It's a scandal. The people that do this, in my view, they're Kathleen Kenyon, who was one of the leading archaeologists back in the 50s. I think she died in the 70s. I think she was demonic, the way she did this. It's just absolutely awful what they've done. So now let me go back to Shechem. We went up to Nablus, and you drive in through these checkpoints, and Shechem sits here in the middle, is ancient Shechem. Is my cursor showing up? Right in here. Between two mountains, Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim. The Samaritan Temple is up on Mount Gerizim. Jacob's Well is beneath the church, not too far from ancient Shechem, just like a few blocks away. And this is the well where it's Jacob's Well. It's very deep. You pour water in, it takes it 5 or 6 seconds to hit water down below. And I don't know how many of you have been there, but this is where Jesus met the Samaritan woman. And she says, my people say we should worship in that mountain. Your people say you should worship in that mountain. And Jesus says, well, there's a time coming you're going to worship in spirit and truth. But the ruins of the Samaritan Temple, you can see them from the church here. You can see them from the tell at ancient Shechem. And this, Abraham built an altar here. Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal. Here's the tell. And in the center here, you have, you see the square thing in the middle? It's a temple fortress. And the Bible talks about a temple fortress. You can look it up. And it talks about destroying the temple fortress. So we walk up and Joel goes, look down. Look how thick the walls are. Who builds a temple with walls this thick? Well, unless you're building a temple fortress, right? And there it is. Oh man, I have no idea what happened here. I apologize. So it's Shechem. There we go. In the center there, it talks about in Joshua chapter 8. They fought the battle of Ai, they defeated Ai, took it over. And so Joshua brings them to Shechem, where Abraham had built an altar. And he puts half the people of Israel on Mount Gerizim, half of them on Mount Ebal. And Mount Ebal, the curses, the blessings, half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal. And there's probably, easily over a couple million people there, maybe 4 or 5 million. And you can sort of hear them in this natural amphitheater shouting back and forth. And they build the altar on the mountain where the curses were shouted. And Joshua read them the law, the entire book of the law, to remind them of their history and their connection to the land and what God had said and what God had done for them all the way through. This is talked about in Joshua 24:19 through 28, the temple fortress. And in this temple fortress, you go and you see this stone. It's about 7 feet tall, but it's only about 1/3 of what they found. Now, the reason why you say that is, in this, it says, so he read them the book of the law, in Joshua 18. Oh man, I don't understand what happened. I've never had this happen before. Anyway, here's the story. It says, Joshua erected a stone in Shechem. You can go there today, and I am telling you with as much confidence as I can. I'm a lawyer, I like evidence. That's the stone that Joshua erected. Probably in the 1300 BC, early 1300s BC. So what are we talking about? 3,500 years ago. Because when they excavated, they found this giant stone, they had to break it in pieces, and then they realized, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is the stone that Joshua erected. And then they talk about, then there's just one more because I'm sort of running out of time. They go to Shiloh. And today you can go to Shiloh, and in this area of the tell, down here in the lower left-hand corner, this area in here, is where they put the tabernacle. And it stood there for 370 years, the tabernacle of Moses. Now, eventually they replaced the fabric walls with stones, but this is where Samuel was from. This is where Samuel heard the voice of the Lord. It's where the Philistines came and got the ark. And today you can go there and you can stand and look at the places where this happened. By the way, this platform here is 77 feet wide. The tabernacle was 75 feet wide. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. And you can even see what looked like fence posts in the ground. So here's the point, and I'll wrap up because I'm out of time. There is this everlasting conflict between the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob. Now, this will be wrapped up in some way. If you read the book of Obadiah, which I think is a prophecy about how this is dealt with, Edom, Esau is wiped out like they never were. Now, how that plays out in today's geopolitics, I don't know. But I do know that it's coming, because this is what the Bible says. This is how this conflict gets resolved. When I see things unfold in Bible prophecy, I have mixed emotions. I'm glad that they happen. I'm glad that they want to build a temple. But I also know that there's consequences to that. And there's this period of judgment and tough times for earth and everybody in them coming. So I talked about this last week, and it's had an impact. I read an article. What do we do? How do we pray? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Well, God's will is that this prophetic picture and things and events unfold exactly like he said. And so I want to pray, as hard as it is sometimes, God, fulfill everything to your glory. Fulfill it exactly, whether I like it or not. I don't want people to suffer, but I want God to be glorified by fulfilling his word. And he's going to work through that land and through those people. And we can argue about the fine details, but this really is the epicenter, and Jerusalem is the epicenter. And I think Doug's going to talk about Jerusalem and sort of the final conflagration, one of the Dougs. I have a name tag for you if you need it. This is where it happens. I'd encourage you to go there and try to get up into these areas. Because as we went through these areas, let me advance just one more slide. I was struck by this. I'd never been there before. I'd been to Israel twice. I'd never seen this part. And we spent 3 days in this part. This is near Shiloh. This is also near Shiloh. What just struck me was every mountain, every hillside from top to bottom is terraced for farming. You drive 20 miles, every hillside is terraced. Every mountain is terraced. There were a lot of people that lived here. And the world denies the connection of the Jewish people to that land to this day. It is stunning to me. God is at the point, I think, where he's going to take care of all that, and he's going to show people his power and his glory. Thanks.
Well done. Thank you, John. Fantastic. All right, well, this is your chance to grill him. Good stuff, indeed. And so thank you, John, very much. Very informative. Man, I'll tell you, there's so much in Israel.
Yeah.
So much in Israel. And even if you've been there several times, and I remember seeing some of those terraces, but I never really thought about it, like, what's up with that? But you're right, that took a lot of work. It takes a lot of people to do that. And so there's no denying.
They didn't evolve.
That's right. Well, some things like, people. Anyway, just joking. Okay, any questions, you guys? Any questions? Fantastic.
Norm.
Okay.
I don't think speakers are allowed to ask other speakers.
All right.
I just wanted to ask, one of the things I always try to do is to help people understand that conflict and that it's been going on is when also with Ishmael and Isaac, and the promise that God makes to Sarah, or the angel makes to Hagar, about Ishmael. And he said he'll be the wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. Do you feel that's part of this too?
Yeah, no question. In fact, when Ishmael, I think, if I recall correctly, I think it came up in my studying for this, that Ishmael was sort of like, when he got the promise, Ishmael was mocking it as well. Sarah was laughing and Ishmael was mocking this promise. And it's continued all the way through. I don't like it. I wish there could be peace. I'm all for peace. But, you know, I see this thing against God's plan, and it's gone on for 4,000 years. You know, and Hebron is an old, I mean, there's a staircase in Hebron you walk down. And when Abraham came to Hebron, roughly 4,000 years ago, that staircase was already 500 to 700 years old. It's one of the oldest staircases they've ever found, and we walked on it. And it's right in no man's land, and there's Jewish patrols here, and there's Palestinian flags here. You're just smacked over the head with the scope of the conflict and how it doesn't appear to be any way that, you know, self-important politicians in Europe that can't even control their own countries, or the Middle East, or even in America, are going to resolve this. And if it is, it's just going to lead. There's eventually going to be a massive war there. We know, and I don't know. My personal opinion is I think it triggers some of the other conflicts that we see that are going to go on there.
Excellent. Really quick, Doug, here's a question. Why do the women wear headdresses, or whatever you call them? So why do they wear headdresses?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a woman, so I know some of the Orthodox women shave their head and wear wigs in Jerusalem.
Okay, Doug, I'll give this microphone to you on one condition. It's going to be short.
And I don't know if they're talking about Muslim or Jewish women.
Okay, now, when I was in Israel at Hebron, about, I think it was 1983, there were about, maybe 20 or so Jews. Levinson was there. It was a very tiny settlement. And I mean, it looked like a fortress, but it was very tiny. We had lunch with him and everything. Now, how many Jews are in Hebron now? And how about IDF protection? What's the situation?
Yeah, well, okay. I think there are around 3,000. 3,000 Jews, yeah, settlers. Because there's a couple settlements. It's heavily fortified. I mean, to get into Old Hebron, you know, as a Palestinian Arab, you got to go through security to get in, let alone to get out. And it's like a fortress. And then there's no man's land. And as you go through no man's land, we're driving on these streets, and all we see are Humvees and other Israel IDF security, highly secure armored vehicles. And as we're driving down, the soldiers are putting up security cameras everywhere. And by the way, I never felt like nobody was not watching me when I was in Israel, okay? Because there are security cameras everywhere. And so even though they took them down to the Temple Mount, I think they have these little tiny drones, 4K drones, that they can put up and see everything that's going on. But Hebron is incredibly fortified. It's soldier patrols on the top of the tell. They can't even excavate where David's palace was, because our guy says, we can't go up there because the soldiers are patrolling up there. And when we parked, he said, you know, well, I hope they don't throw rocks at my car today, because it has an Israeli license plate. And we're parked like right in no man's land, you know, and sometimes they throw rocks at my car, and I'm like, well, do they ever throw rocks at your car while you're still in it? You know, because they don't know if you're Jewish or not. They usually leave Americans alone. When we were coming out of Nablus, we got stopped at a checkpoint because they had it shut down. Because the day before, about a mile away, a Jewish settler had shot and killed a Palestinian. The Palestinian press said Israeli settler opens fire on Palestinian protesters. The real story was there were about 400 of them throwing rocks, like softball-sized hail rocks. You would know a little bit about that. I see hail damage signs all over the place and ripped up roofs. And they descended on this guy's car, and he pulled out a gun and shot him. And like most of the settlers, he had, I think, 9 or 11 children. That was the other thing, and I know we're over. I'm not really worried about the people there not being outbred by the Arab Muslims. The birth rate in Israel is through the roof. In a half-mile stretch, the 1 kilometer stretch of a street in an Orthodox neighborhood coming into Jerusalem the first night we got there, I know I saw over 100 baby strollers in a kilometer and hundreds of other little kids. We went out to eat, and there were Orthodox couples all over the place, and I'm not exaggerating. Every single one of them had a baby under the age of 1. So it appears that they're not just studying the Torah. I guess it's the way that...
they're keeping Torah for sure, though.
I don't know how... That's the diplomatic way to say it.
Just really quick announcement. We are going to Israel next year, the Way Congregation. So if you are looking for someone to go with, if you've never gone, if you want to go back, we invite you to come with us. You can look at thewaycongregation.com, and we have information about that. It'll be next April 2019. One last question.
Highly recommend it.
We got to move on.
I'd just like to make a comment and support what you're saying, John. I had the privilege of being right where you were in last September, and we went with a ministry called Hayavel, and we were harvesting grapes for 3 weeks right up. We were staying right up there in Mount Gerizim, which is Habraka. And I would, like you said, these people are so courageous that are living in the West Bank. These are Jews who really are identifying with the land, with God. They're so godly. They're so close to where we are, even though they don't yet believe in Yeshua. And yet, they're only like 97% of the tourists don't go there. And so when you come from the States or anywhere as tourists and you're supporting them and believe, it does so much for them to see you because they don't see anybody.
Right.
And on top of it, if we really believe we're Ephraim, when you're there and you say, oh my Lord, this is the land we walked, our forefathers walked on. We're coming home here. It just blows your mind. So,
yeah, there is
anyway.
this awakening that I think is prophetic that's taking place. We know it's not at the end yet. You know, we know that temple's not going to save them or anything like that. But it's part of the plan. And now we see them going up there, 1,300 the other day on Tish B'Av, or the 9th of Av. And I just think, we're seeing it unfold. I talk about it every week. And I'm always amazed each week. By Thursday, sometimes I think, I don't have anything to talk about. Okay, by Sunday morning, it's like, okay, how do I keep this to 4 hours? And
speaking of 4 hours,
we're over.
We're over time. So here's the plan. Make it a really quick break. Use the bathroom, get a drink, come back, okay? Because we have, last but not least, we saved the best for last. We got Norm Franz. He is going to be the last speaker for the night. And then we have a really fun panel discussion on the topic of the rapture. Okay, nothing controversial there. Okay, so let's make this a quick break and then let's get right back in here.